What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a sort of progress update for my run through the Ultimate, which is what I would consider one of the hardest challenges in CRPGs. In particular, this one is for Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire, and is an official competition. Now, towards the end of November, I put out a video talking about what this challenge is and how I wanted to finally get around to completing it. It officially kicked off in, I think it was 2019, and in that time since, only a little over a dozen people have actually finished it. At least officially. Now, in that original video, I went over all the rules and the actual challenge itself, so I'll link that down below if you're curious. I don't feel like doing it again here. Outside of the most important bit, which is that it's possible to do this challenge without official recognition, and then there's the official recognition. Basically, Obsidian put out this challenge, and the first 12 people to do it got their names put on a plaque that hangs in their lobby. I actually got the chance to see it in person when I was there last November, which was really cool for me. And seeing it in person kind of lit the fire under myself to be like, I would like to actually finish that finally. But the other 38 people to complete it after that get sent a badge and an official letter from Obsidian. Now, in order to get that, you have to send Obsidian your save file as well as a full video recording of the playthrough. Since I've made that initial video, a few people have been asking here and there what it looks like, if I'm still working on it, etc. And obviously the answer is yes. But what's more, it's actually been done for a while on my end. I'm actually waiting for Obsidian to verify the run at this point, which I had been holding off mentioning because it's actually been a little while back, and the holidays were busy enough as it is. But frankly, I've been getting impatient and I've been wanting to speak about it. So I completed a run of the Ultimate back on, I think it was December 13th, and then I sent over the save file and the recording to Obsidian on the 14th, I think, the very next day. And thus, I'm just waiting for them to get through it and hopefully, of course, verify it. And so while the run itself is complete and has been, the challenge isn't really complete until we get that official verification, and I want to make that crystal clear, and that's why this is a simple progress update. Now, a few days after I sent them all of that, they got back to me and basically, explained that obviously they're about to be on their holiday break, and then they'd be getting around to verifying it in January, mostly in regards to actually watching all the footage to go through all of it. Now, I would assume they verified the save file first, just to spare themselves watching the footage ahead of time, or at least that's how I would do it personally, but who knows. But of course, as many people may be aware, several areas around LA have been dealing with, I would say, catastrophic fires, and while it is a bit away from Obsidian's office, I would not be surprised at all to learn that they have been impacted by that in some form or fashion, and that's before you even start to mention slightly less life-threatening things like the fact that they have a game launching next month. So my point being, they are busy, and frankly with things that are infinitely more important than verifying this. So while I hope to hear from them soon, ultimately, it is absolutely no rush on my end if they get to it when they get to it. So current status-wise, that's pretty much it, but for the sake of making this video slightly more interesting, there are a few other things I wanted to mention, just challenges and things that went pretty smoothly. Now, some stuff I'm going to save for a big, this run is officially complete style video where I then kind of go over next steps in terms of what I want to do with all the footage from this run. And for the record, if you're wondering, I will make that publicly available for everyone after the run is verified, though even if it isn't, I will likely still wind up using it for some stuff, for starters explaining, what the ins and outs of that run were and what I'll do different on a potential future one in that scenario. Because honestly, this first run has been anything but clean, even if it was finally successful. It was a real mess, but one way or another you're likely to see it. Now, if the run actually gets confirmed, I plan on making it available on a separate channel just outright so you can watch the entire thing in full, but I also plan on cutting it up into pieces so I can add a commentary on top of it and kind of explain what I did and why for this channel. That way I can release that sort of episodically and walk people through the challenge, as I ultimately used what is by far and away the most common approach. Now, the first thing I want to mention is two little not so insubstantial mistakes that I made that did give me a defeat but not a game over. And truth be told, I think if anything leads to this run not being verified, it might be this, because I don't think it's against the rules, because it is in fact just how the game works, but the official rules state anything that's against the spirit of the competition, and I just don't know if they'll include that. But basically, during Console Hot and one of the world bosses, the attack that I used to kill the boss also downed my character. But the thing is, in Pillars of Eternity 2, when that happens, that is to say when your entire party goes down, but then the enemy dies almost immediately after that, the game will flash a defeat screen, but not the game over screen. And that's important because if it's just the defeat screen and then suddenly combat ends, your characters will actually all get back up. And that's especially important for things like the Ultimate and just Iron Man in general, because unless it's the actual game over screen, then the save file doesn't get deleted, and the game just continues on like normal. But truth be told, even those two mistakes really weren't the messiest thing about this run. In fact, the, I would say, biggest pain point of this entire thing for me is I got some of the worst shop RNG it is possible to get. If you don't know, the way shops work in, I think both games actually, is that most of them have like a set stock that they always have, but then they have like sort of RNG lists that they'll pull from to restock their store with. It's like 12 to 24 in-game hours. And in particular, there's a couple shops in Nekataka, the game's main city, that you need to spawn, at the very least, a tusk. A tusk is an item we need to enchant another item later that I didn't wind up getting to use, which made a few bosses a nightmare. But I couldn't get this anywhere. And then on top of that, I actually got a little out of sync with my days passing, which means I lost a bunch of time tracking down what's called the Deck of Many Things, which is like a sailing ship that you need to buy a very specific item from, so it's not negotiable that you meet up with it. So just terrible shop RNG that I'll detail more thoroughly if I actually get this run verified. But basically, it cost me a whole lot of time, and as a result of that, not only were a few bosses harder, but I came in under the time limit for the challenge, like the in-game days passing, by like less than, I think it was like 24 hours. I was right away from losing it. It was by the skin of my teeth. Now, the other thing I want to talk about before we wrap this particular video up is the two world bosses. So the reason we need that tusk from a shop is because it ultimately, in combination with items we get from fighting the rest of the bosses, grants us everything we need to enchant an item called Scordeo's Edge with a buff called Blade Cascade. Now, you get Scordeo's Edge from siding with Captain Aeldis in the Principe during the quest, I think it's called Honor Among Thieves, where we deal with a bunch of slavers. And we do all that, A, to get the ghost ship to get to the end of the game without a hassle, but also because of Scordeo's Edge. If you can enchant that with Blade Cascade, you can, through a variety of means involving the challenge specifically, basically capture its buff that it puts on your character for 5 seconds, but permanently. And that's important because what Blade Cascade does is effectively remove the recovery time from your character while that buff is up. And because we keep infinitely prolonging it with a few other abilities, this essentially means that for an entire fight, our character will immediately following each and one of their attacks, basically removing any amount of cooldown on individual attack speed. Now, believe it or not, as powerful as that is, you don't actually need it with the most common method of beating this challenge, except for two bosses. And even there, I proved it wasn't necessary, but it is extremely helpful. And those two bosses are the Voracious Mountain and the Hellfire Construct, both of which are very difficult for very different reasons. Let's start with the Hellfire Construct. Basically, you need Scordeo's Edge here because this guy heals himself with his own fire damage, and he also interrupts your character constantly. So basically you need that item to put through enough damage to overcome his healing, and also to avoid getting interrupted and not doing any damage at all. Now, through some trial and error, I did discover, however, that you don't actually need that, it's just very helpful. You will deal enough damage to this dude slowly over time to kill him with the traditional method, but this fight, as a result, took me 2 hours, whereas with Scordeo's Edge, it's normally like 5 to 10 minutes. And considering I was already pressed for time, it wasn't a good time. Though truth be told, I'm much more impressed with myself for the fight that is right before that, which is the Voracious Mountain. This is a boss that splits into parts every time you kill it, and each of those parts can regenerate back into the whole, effectively making this boss a rush to DPS and interrupt these guys down so they can't reanimate into their bigger forms. So basically you kill the first main blob here, which then divides into two bigger blobs. Those two blobs won't try to reconfigure into the big boss until they are down to 50% health, which basically means you need to burn one of them down, which then continues to cascade into smaller forms until you get them all completely gone before focusing on the next one. Scordeo's is necessary here, or highly recommended, I should say, because I didn't use it, because the removal of that recovery time allows you to effectively use spells and things to interrupt these merges, which are otherwise very hard to interrupt. While I was stuck on this for days trying to find a way around this because I didn't have that item, I actually did discover something that I'm not sure I've ever seen anybody else mention, and that is a much more difficult, admittedly, way of dealing with this guy. You see, I discovered that if we first make sure Vela is safe on one end of the map, and then drag slowly the mountain over to the other side of the map, which is possible because every time we are in stealth and distract an enemy, say with like a spell cast or something like that, in this case invisibility by the way, it will slowly start to investigate and then go back to where it was. But when it goes back to where it was, it actually stops a little bit short of its original position, which means slowly over time you can reset its original position, so to speak, where you need it, which means eventually you can drag this guy up to the corner. At this point, you have to buff to the nines with that infinite prolonging ability called Salvation of Time. This is important because this Voracious Mountain guy actually has a buff called, I think it's corrosive something or another, that removes time from your buffs, which means in order to power through that, we have to have like several minutes built up at least. Or he'll strip our buffs, which are keeping us alive, and then kill us immediately. But really that's only half the problem, because once we actually destroy this guy, he splits into those two forms, and they can do pretty much the same thing with slightly smaller stats. But this is where it gets interesting, because what I learned was if you kill the big form, the actual boss, when he splits into his two forms, if we then re-enter invisibility, these two bigger blobs enter a sort of like patrol around the map. But because we're on the other side of the map from the little girl we have to protect all throughout the playthrough, their patrol never aggroes her, because our character is too far away, and nothing actually aggroes on her unless we are nearby first. But because these two patrol around the map, basically what I was able to do is use this to actually separate the oozes. And that's important because the issue with Outscordeo's Edge is that you can't deal enough DPS to either interrupt or simply burst one of these down before they recombine. So I was able to use this patrolling behavior that I discovered to separate these two smaller oozes, burst one of them down into its smaller forms, and then immediately stop what I was doing, re-enter invisibility again, and separate out those smaller forms. Now everything under that second tier dispersal, let's call it, actually functions a bit differently than the initial split. And that is because they don't patrol afterwards. They stay wherever they spawned at. And the two that are smaller than the initial split, the secondary split, they start trying to recombine at 75% health. And then everything under those, which is two more, starts to try to do it immediately. But they have so little health that if we hit them with an AoE, they'll die immediately. So basically what I had to do at that point is separate these guys out again and then finally use my big AoE burst to clear them out until I was left with just one gigantic ooze, the first split, at which point the fight was pretty much won through a method that I discovered over several days. Fighting this guy took literally longer than any other part of the run, and I have legitimately never seen anybody ever mention that you could do this or how it worked, and that's probably because the only method that you could use this with is basically for the ultimate, which is with Bareth's challenge enabled, which keeps combat up, as without it this simply wouldn't be possible. But basically, in spite of getting terrible RNG for the shops on this run, which prevented me from getting a key item I thought I was going to need, I was able to find a way around it, and regardless of whether or not this run gets verified, I thought that was extremely cool. But believe it or not, that's just a little bit of what I want to talk about with this run ultimately, and I will save the rest for when we speak about this again. So, simply put, thanks for listening to me ramble. Again, as it stands right now, the ball is in Obsidian's court waiting for them to either verify or refute this one. And either way, I'll certainly go from there and keep you guys updated. But at this point, I think I've pretty well got this challenge figured out, and I'm going to get it one way or another. And so hopefully soon we can be celebrating victory. But for right now, that's pretty much going to do it. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.